In part 2 of our in-season return on investment series, we focus on tactics to help you maximize your bottom line this season. In this episode, Dr. Michael Kenty and Dr. Greg Willoughby are joined by Helena brand manager Tony Lourens as we focus on how fungicides can impact your crop's performance and return on investment this season. Plus, Jody Lourens joins us from Nashville to discuss how recent trade meetings with China and the global weather patterns are creating in-season marketing opportunities for growers. Stay tuned for these tips and more on this episode of FieldLink. Hey folks, for over 4 years, we've been bringing you agronomy, markets, and political news that impacts farmers and ranchers every day. We're excited to announce that we'll be bringing a new podcast to your podcast of choice in late July called the FieldLink Specialty Podcast, hosted by Macy Carter. On this podcast, we'll cover key topics that impact the landscape, turf, industrial management, aquatics, and nursery industry. Be on the lookout for the FieldLink Specialty Podcast from your friends here at Helena. And welcome back to this special episode of FieldLink as we focus on in-season return on investment. And today we're going to be in segment number 2, talking about investments and what we can do to increase yield profitability when we're talking about in-season treatments. And today's focus is going to be on fungicides. And joining us in the FieldLink studio is Tony Lourens, brand manager for the Helena Products Group. Tony, welcome to FieldLink.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate being here.
All right. And also joining us on this particular episode is Dr. Greg Willoughby from Indiana. Greg, welcome to FieldLink.
Thank you very much.
Well, guys, it's great to have you all here joining us on this episode of FieldLink as we really focus on what we can do to maximize profitability this summer as the crop's growing right now. And Greg, we'll ask about, how things are looking across pretty much the Midwest with your geography that you cover. But before we dive there, Greg, tell us a little bit about you and what your role is with the Helena Products Group.
So I am what Helena labels a technical service manager for what we geographically call the Northern Business Unit, which basically is the Corn Belt of the Midwest. So Ohio through Colorado and Canada down through Missouri, Colorado, Kansas, and Kentucky. And half my time is spent working in research and development. So products that we're developing in our research facilities that we're testing for 2 to 3 years before they actually make it into the farmer market. And then the other half of the time, I do training with our field people and our customers on how those products fit agronomically into the system. I live in Lafayette, Indiana, and cover that geography. So
awesome. Well, you certainly cover a wide range of geography as we look at the corn and soybean belt across the Midwest. And Greg, tell us a little bit about that right now. How are the crops looking? How's corn, soybeans looking across your geography?
Yeah, so acreage-wise, we've seen a rebound. So we're back to very close to that normal corn bean rotation. We did see a shift to that planting earlier because of prices of fertilizer and commodities combined. That seems to have equaled out to be pretty much close to what we normally see here in the Midwest. There is a lot of variability in planting dates. As we move, particularly in the Eastern Corn Belt, we'll have corn that's only 2-leaf collar all the way up to V7, V8 that are within.
Wow.
We started off in the Eastern Corn Belt in a drought situation, which is unusual for us. That has alleviated itself in under 45 days for the most part. And so we have quite a variation in the corn staging. Soybeans are pretty much spot on as far as how that is tracking compared to normal.
Yeah, they're looking pretty normal. I was just up in that area and crops look pretty good for the most part as I was traveling through South Dakota and Iowa and so forth.
We're set pretty good from a yield potential standpoint at this stage. The concerns obviously that are developing is people who did a lot of pre-plant nitrogen. This rainfall in the middle and eastern part of the Corn Belt, we've lost a lot of nitrogen. And so how that works into how farmers react to that will determine that. And then just in the 10 days, tar spot has started blowing up across the eastern part of the Corn Belt and even now into the eastern half of Nebraska. So how that disease progresses, and then we have the El Nino fact that's sitting there in the background that we just aren't for sure exactly how that's going to impact us in the long term.
And definitely, we've had some rains across much of the Midwest as we're focusing on that area, but really across the United States, we've got moisture hot, and in some areas are still a little dry, but it really just depends where you're at, and it's going to be a different story. But Greg, this is a real critical time for growers as we get ready to really ramp up that yield potential. You mentioned it earlier, and in the podcast, last week's podcast, we talked about with Jason Gregory, and we talked to him a lot about Metra, Coron Metra, utilizing that for some of those nitrogen deficiencies, and in episode 1 of our series here. Today, we're focusing on fungicides, and boy, that is a big story to be told, especially as we set this crop up for 2026.
Diseases are always a player in our crop production seasons, whether we're talking wheat or we're talking corn and soybeans. What really throws into the system is what happens weather-wise, particularly humidity. Mm-hmm. And you can talk cloud cover, or you can talk about how much sunlight. You can look at that either glass half empty or half full scenario of how bad that impact is going to be. And, with the advent of tar spot now being throughout a large chunk of the Midwest, that is a disease that tends to overwinter. And we only really have 3 diseases that overwinter in the Midwest. That's gray leaf spot, tar spot, and then anthracnose. Those do overwinter, so they're here as soon as weather conditions permit them to manifest themselves. Whereas all the other corn foliar diseases, your northern corn leaf spot, leaf blight, your southern, your rust, all blow in on the wind patterns from the south. So we're always looking to the south and the west to see what they have developing, to see what we're going to get. But the others, it's really about the environment. And so far this year, the environment is kicking in some of these overwintering diseases starting to occur pretty fast.
So the stage is really set for, potentially a big fungal year as we look at the 26 crop. Greg, tell us, what's kind of been changing? Talk about things that are shifting, and, great tar spots, not necessarily new to the Midwest, but it's becoming more and more prevalent. A wider range, isn't it?
Yeah, so tar spot in particular is a fungus. We do have some bacterial diseases, but fungicides do nothing to control there. So bacterials, we just kind of have to deal with as an aside. These fungal pathogens is where our fungicides come in. And most of the time, the responses to these fungicides, the most economical benefit is when they're treated somewhere in that V10 category up through, particularly in the case of tar spot, R3, maybe R4. That's the window that we usually try to target because that's our biggest economic return for that dollar being invested.
So Tony Lourens, brand manager, you've been working in this industry for some time and dealing with lots of different fungicides. We've had a great discussion here, understanding the why and what's going on in the field, especially in the northern Corn Belt, learning about lots of different modes of action. I guess what growers are looking for is it worth it? Is it really worth it from a financial standpoint? And from your years of experience, are fungicides really worth the investment, Tony?
Yeah, Bill, we've actually developed and launched a number of new fungicides in the past couple of years. And ultimately, what we plan on, the way we see a farmer approaching fungicides is it needs to give him a 3 or 4 to 1 return on investment to make it a viable choice for a farmer.
Right.
And certainly some of our key brands like Odyssey, for example, we feel like it gives that at the very least. But I will say this, Dr. Willoughby is the expert for that market, and I defer to him on the ROI.
Yeah, definitely, and we'll certainly talk about that. But as you mentioned, 2 to 3 to 1 return on investment, and when we're looking at beans that continue to climb here, especially as we look at global markets shifting a little bit towards the good. There's still some really good opportunities out there. We can't afford not to take advantage of some of these grain markets, especially when we're trying to protect yield. Certainly an opportunity there. Dr. Willoughby, Tony talked a little bit about some of the brands. Odyssey, that's one of the brands that's certainly being focused on in the north. Tell us a little bit about that brand.
So Odyssey is our four-way mode of action, if you will. It has three of those chemical families, but then it also has that fourth mode of action that is that systemic acquired resistance. And that's coming from the phosphite component of Odyssey. From a chemical family, it has the oxystrobin, and it has the tebuconazole, and it has the phosphite. So it has the preventative, it has the curative, it has the one that goes up and down in the plant, so it covers the entire plant tissue. And then that also gives us that SAR effect that gives us a little more health long term once those other chemistries might be weakening through the life cycle.
Definitely seen that really peak last year in some markets where unfortunately some growers were devastated if they chose not to utilize a product like Odyssey. Let's talk about Odyssey. With some of these benefits, it also has great protection for some of those growers out in that western corn belt too, don't it?
Yeah, so when we start moving into the drier areas where tar spot might not be a factor yet because the inoculum hasn't reached there yet even, we still have the rust issues. We have the gray leaf potentials, some of these other foliar diseases that blow in. They come in early enough to affect, but not necessarily in that vegetative growth stage, but more in that reproductive. And in those cases, Odyssey is still a leading contender. It has those mode of action families that can give that rust control, that can give that gray leaf or northern or southern control for those foliar fungal diseases.
Yeah, that's a great double whammy, depending upon where you're at, to handle both tar, southern rust, as well as, other general funguses. Okay, talk to us about rates. What are you seeing? What's effective in your market, Greg?
So we have a lot going out in that 32 ounce range. So 2.25 pint. When we get into the tar spots, when we get into the rusts, we're taking that rate up into about the 40 ounce range. It gives us a little better hold, a little bit longer time frame, particularly when those pressures can ramp up rapidly if the conditions warrant that when that disease is progressing.
Wow. Okay. So we have a pretty good product here in Odyssey, that four-way, as we like to refer to it. Really a wonderful opportunity for growers out there. Tony Lourens, I guess this is what's exciting for a lot of folks is while we have amazing benefits being a four-way, as Dr. Willoughby pointed out, a great solution for tar spot management as well as southern rust, Odyssey kind of comes in at a very competitive price point, doesn't it?
Yeah, we developed this product with a price point in mind that would make ROI for the grower very attractive. And so really recommend that you speak to your local Helena representative, product manager. He can give you an idea for your specific market, what it'll cost. I can assure you it is competitively priced and a very good choice for corn growers.
A lot of bang for your buck there, a lot of quality, a lot of important factors certainly in that product lineup, meaning Odyssey. Okay, Greg, let's talk about that. We know that Odyssey clearly is a top choice. That being said, we have a pretty good portfolio of other products. What's another choice that you might have growers explore if Odyssey doesn't quite maybe fit their market in your area?
So we would move from an Odyssey standpoint, and we would still want to keep those two modes of action in the case of the corn scenario.
Yeah.
And so what we would do is we would move down to a Varus 2XS. And the Varus 2XS is still a strobe. It is still a trizol. So it still has those two modes of actions, those two different families to give us both preventative and curative. And that has been an industry standard for many, many years of that two-way combination. And that's really the minimum where we want to be at on a corn standpoint.
Okay. All right. So we've got Avaris 2X is a great option there. Dr. Willoughby, you've done a great job talking about corn. We've got some great options between Odyssey and Avaris 2XS in that northern corn belt. Let's shift gears slightly here to soybeans. These dynamics on soybeans are also changing over the last 5 years. What have you seen in your marketplace, and what highlights should growers be really thinking about as this disease market changes?
So the interesting thing is beans is that farmers are focusing more on trying to push the yield envelope higher. Beans have always been a struggle of trying to get across the thresholds, and we finally have some genetics that's allowing us to push those yields higher. We understand the nutrition, we understand the growth patterns a little bit better. And so, from a agronomy standpoint, we're seeing a lot more reports of people commenting on some minor diseases that really don't impact yield, your alnarias, your mildews. There's some leaf spots. And even though they're out there, they're not really majorly yield limiting. Septoria is starting to come back as a focus. We kind of went away as we moved from drilled beans into 30-inch row beans because we get more airflow. We don't have the humidity.
Right.
And now then we're moving back to 15s. And so Septoria is starting to come back up. And that gets really important because a soybean plant will reallocate about 50% of its nutrition from the leaf tissue into the beans themselves. And so when we lose leaves due to Septoria, we're actually losing nutrition to build those soybeans, to make them bigger, to make them heavier from a yield standpoint. We've also started to see in the Midwest an increase in frog eye being resistant to strobe chemistries. And so those strobies are becoming less and less effective in some pocket markets. Some people also know frog eye leaf spot as Cercospora in soybeans.
Right.
And so that's a little bit of a shift. We are definitely seeing more sudden death syndrome and more white mold. That is becoming more and more of a challenge because fungicide activity on those aren't controlled, they're suppression in the case of white mold. And then we have new root and stem diseases that have been moving in the eastern corn belt in particular. And fungicides just don't work there. That has to be a seed treatment application at this point in time.
And Greg, if I'm not mistaken, you've seen a pretty big emergence of white mold. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so white mold used to be totally allocated to the northern third of the Midwest. So the Dakotas, Michigan, Wisconsin, that tier of states, if you will. And that's because it tends to like cooler conditions, wetter conditions, cloudier conditions. And, they have a shorter growing season. Even though they have longer days, they're cooler days. And so it has tended to favor that. Recently, however, we have seen that disease progress all the way southward on a regular basis into some areas into Indiana and into Missouri, which used to be solely a sudden death syndrome market. Those two really didn't exist in the same place. And now then we have a good section of the Midwest right through the middle that we have both those occurring oftentimes in the same field at the same time.
Okay, and timing's everything, right? What's the good spray timing for this type of product?
In the case of these foliar soybean diseases, most everything is in an R2, R3 stage.
Okay.
In a case of guys really pushing high yields, there have been some people playing around with running that a little earlier at R1, R2, and then coming in with a second triazole only based fungicide in that R4, R5. So about 30 days later. So giving it two shots, the first one having that preventative with the strobe in a combination with a curative, and then that later one being just a curative to kind of make sure everything is gone before we ended up into grain fill and harvest.
Okay, Greg, there's a lot of choices out there for growers when considering fungicides for soybeans today. There's multiple choices, and this can be kind of complex, can't it?
It can, particularly when you start talking about the frog eye resistance side of the equation. When we're dealing with the plant health aspect, that's the strobe line. The problem we have in strobe with soybeans is that strobilurins make the plants stay greener longer, which means the stems stay green. which makes us run into some harvest challenges at times. So the best fungicide for preventing disease gives us the biggest problem during harvest in a lot of cases. And so that's where people like to go to the Trizol side, which doesn't give us that preventative piece, but does cure whatever disease is there. But it doesn't give us green stems. So it's a trade-off. And that's really where some of this SDHI chemistry is starting to grow, is the partnership between an SDHI that has some of the preventative piece but doesn't give us the green stem, mixing it with the Trizol piece, or taking a Trizol and putting it with a phosphite, so that again we have some of that SAR effect to help fight the disease long season, but again not giving us those green stems.
Okay, all right. So I'm going to shift back to Tony Lourens here a little bit. This timing, all of this can be very challenging for growers, and I guess the big question is, does it make sense for growers to use fungicides on soybeans? Is it important for them?
Absolutely. I think statistics will show that for growers in the Midwest, 60 or more percent of them plan on using a fungicide, will use a fungicide year in, year out. The reason for that is they see that ROI. It's critical for them because ultimately what you're growing a crop for is yield. You get paid on yield.
Right.
And so certainly with the products we position on soybeans, and we've got some great products, Viathon is very competitively priced, gives a great ROI to the grower. He'll get his return on investment returned multiple times.
And there's three modes of action in that, right, Tony?
Yeah, it's a phenomenal chemistry. Greg has been instrumental in helping us position it. It's very similar to Odyssey, just doesn't have the azoxystrobin component. And the strobe is what causes the green stem. And so that's why it fits so well in the Midwest.
Great opportunity there. And Dr. Willoughby, you've done a lot of work with Viathon over the years. Just a really good overall opportunity choice, as Tony mentioned, had a pretty good competitive price point as well.
Yeah, I really like Viathon from a standpoint of it gives us the curative effect of the Trizol, and it matches very well even when we have diseases that strobies control. And a lot of the diseases in soybeans in the Midwest, strobies aren't the greatest at control. The Trizols do the heavy lifting. And so we picked the heaviest hitter from a fungicide standpoint from that family, but then putting it with that phosphite really zones in on that plant's defenses. And it takes so long in a soybean plant to develop the bean, to grow the bean, to mature the pod, that having a disease protection that lasts a longer period of time, that phosphite piece in that chemistry really, I think, gives us that heavy lift.
Okay. All right. Okay. And Greg, while you're working in the Midwest, I mean, if you're out there spraying a fungicide on your soybeans, you're making that trip. Probably makes a pretty good point to maybe throw some nutritionals in it at the same time.
Exactly. As I mentioned, and almost 50% of a lot of the nutrients are translocated out of the leaves into that bean that you're going to try to pull in and with a combine and haul off the field. And so if we're protecting leaf tissue or we've suffered damage to leaf tissue, we've suffered some nutritional loss that can be translocated into that bean. So supplementing fungicide applications in corn and beans, actually both, in that nutritional or in that fungicide timing is a really wise move. In particular, we've had good luck with obviously Coron, which you talked about in the previous episode, from supplementing nitrogen.
Yep.
Beans like nitrogen later. The later the better for higher yields, actually, because we don't want to interfere with the natural biology of those beans fixing their own nitrogen. But also we've had really good luck with foliar phosphorus being put into those reproductive applications. And those are the two kind of leading contenders when we look at our data sets of being good companion nutritional products with the fungicide rights.
Dr. Willoughby, there's a couple of other good choices for fungicides for growers to consider. As you mentioned, Viathon is a really, really good one for soybeans, but we've got a couple others out there as well.
So Odyssey and Averis both are also labeled for soybeans and gives us two other different price points, if you will, but also gives us more levels of coverage by introducing that Strobe back into that fungicide program, with the added risk that we may have some green stem issues that develop in those. But we do get a little wider coverage of some of our disease coverages when we throw that Strobe back in.
Okay, and Tony, as we kind of wrap things up here on this segment, any other comments about some of the products that might be good choices for growers out there as relates to fungicides and soybeans?
Really, I think Greg covered it. By far and away, Viathon is the product of choice for soybean growers. A higher end product would be Odyssey, and then a Verist 2XS as well.
Excellent. Some great options for growers in that northern corn belt and soybean belt. And great information, Dr. Willoughby. We want to thank you for joining us here on this episode of FieldLink. And Tony, thank you for sharing your insight too. Many years of history here working in this space of fungicide treatments. Guys, thanks for joining us on this episode of FieldLink. Okay, now we're going to welcome into the studio Dr. Michael Kenty. Michael, welcome to the FieldLink podcast studio.
Thank you, Bill.
Michael, you're responsible for really overseeing a lot of the product portfolio from a specialist standpoint, really in the South. Tell us a little bit about your role real quick.
Marketing, stewardship, some product development work, and troubleshooter when things don't go right.
Yeah, and you've been doing this a while, and you've got a lot of experience with Helena and beyond, and really in the entire industry. So we're excited to have you in the booth today. Okay, Dr. Kenty, bring us up to speed. Where are we at with the corn crop in the South right now?
The corn crop is really ahead of where it normally is. I was in Kentucky last week, and it is tasseling there. Mm-hmm. I saw very few fields that aren't at tassel or about to tassel, and we've already done a lot of disease spraying, but the concern of southern rust, I think the corn crop is going to outrun it for the most part.
Okay.
And there's the minor diseases like gray leaf spots, cribrillaria, maypop, but they're blowing and going right now and taking care of business and then starting to look at other crops.
Yeah. So a lot of the fungicides have already been applied in the South on corn for the most part, obviously starting south into Louisiana, Texas. That happened, a handful of weeks to a month ago.
Yes, this season has been very compressed.
Yeah.
I've been in the business a while. Won't go into the years, but I do not recall as a compressed season in my entire career.
Yeah. Well, and as you bring it up, every year's different in agriculture, and we're looking at another different one. And it appears like, hey, the corn crop looks pretty good in the South for the most part. And you guys had a pretty good run with the Varus 2XS this year.
We had a really good run with the Varus 2XS, and the location's still spraying. That is their primary choice. They're doing a mix of that for disease control plus a biostimulant with nutritional to get the whole package, control the disease, push the crop.
And taking advantage of that spray, right? That extra trip across the field.
Save on diesel.
That's right. And that is very important these days, isn't it?
Yes, very much.
Okay. And, in this episode, we're talking about return on investment. And obviously, growers in the South are seeing a huge advantage with our Varus 2X as well as other fungicides with their corn crop. They've got to do it. You got to build it in.
Yes. And, it's a good return on investment anytime you do it because the genetics are great. They keep getting better, but there's a point where you change the genetics, Mother Nature changes, the disease will still be there. If you don't protect what you have the potential, you're not going to maximize your yield, benefit, and your profit. So when growers start wondering how much this costs, always look, how much will it cost you if you don't do it? How much are you leaving on the table? And that is where if you change the mindset and they start thinking about, I got this workhorse, it's making a potential to make 250, 300 bushels of corn or 100 bushels of soybeans. If I don't protect it and feed it and keep it going, I will not make my goal.
Yeah, definitely. And growers are recognizing that. And that's one of the purposes of this particular episode is really to focus on that in-season return on investment. There's still a lot of opportunity to be made by managing that crop properly in season. And sometimes we get caught up, I got to, really, watch your pennies. And we certainly want to do that. But we're talking about making yield, not just protecting it most of the time.
That is correct. And if a grower is really trying to decide, do I want to spend the money on a Varus, or do I want to spend the money on a Coron or nutritional or even insecticide? They got to look at, okay, if I do this, this will cost me 1.5 bushels. That's a small amount, because if they don't protect, their losses could be 10, 15, 20 bushels.
Right.
And where do you go to the bank with that?
It's really a fundamental call. We talked a lot about, yield advantages across the board and general performance for a lot of these fungicides. We're seeing some really good ROI on them, and we need to continue to talk about that because it's really, really important. Okay, let's shift from corn. As you said, most of that's being wrapped up. However, there are a couple things you guys are still monitoring, though, for corn.
Yes, we're monitoring spore counts. Everybody's still checking. There are some fields that had to be replanted.
Okay.
So they're not quite at the time.
Yeah.
And the growers that have those are very concerned about them, because you get advanced crop and you got a little later crop.
Yeah.
Diseases will still hit it when they're there, because as the bulk of the crop progresses, your disease presence by spores is out there.
Yep.
They're looking for a healthy host.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. There are spots, especially in the South, where it was pretty wet and got washed out, and we have some replant all over the board. Really, as a grower, you need to be paying attention to those replant spots.
Yes.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, let's pivot to soybeans. Let's talk about where are we at with the bean crop right now?
We have beans that are R3, and this is going all the way to south.
And when we say south, all the way to southern Louisiana.
Southern to I-10 corridor into East Texas. Houston, just past Houston, is about the border.
Okay.
Say I-35 east is soybeans.
Yep.
Everything else, they don't have any soybeans.
Yeah, straight up from Houston all the way through Dallas and all the way up really to Kansas City to the east for the most part in that part of the world.
But there were R3 beans in Kentucky last week. Wow. But getting to R3 just means you need to pay attention to diseases. And I even heard some growers last week planning on possibly doing 2 treatments, 2 applications using two totally different fungicides, maybe using a cheap one for just our initial, coming back with Mako second shot.
Okay.
Some that were doing 1 shot only, we're going to do Mako only.
Okay.
But just like corn, they're combining a nutritional, a biostimulant, a good adjuvant for spreading and sticking, and they're banking on making money from the application, getting that ROI, because beans could make 100 bushels if you have water. Right. We've had plenty of water. We have good genetics. The downside, because of the weather patterns, we got great disease pressure. There's frog eye leaf spot spores throughout, and I've been seeing them since March. I saw my first lesion in the field in Kentucky last week. Okay. Because I haven't been able to go to the field much this year, but they're all over from one end of the spectrum of the business unit to the other. Frog eye is the number one, but then you got minor diseases that Mako will help control as well.
Yeah, definitely. Let's talk a little bit more about Mako. Tell us about Mako. What makes up Mako?
It is a difenoconazole azoxystrobin. So you've got 2 modes of action. You got a group 11, group 3. They have control and systemic, contact kill systemic stuff. Because of the 2 modes of action, they may be addressing the same disease, but their attack on the disease is different. If you do one mode of action over and over and over, you'll do like we did in soybeans and got Roundup resistant weeds.
Right.
So 2 modes of action is always the way to go. Pair it with good genetics. Our seed specialists are really good about telling you what varieties to watch out. There's some varieties I did not know till last week in a meeting that seem to be more susceptible to frog eye. So if you by chance planted that, you need to be more diligent. But I would assume every field of beans needs a shot of fungicide. Good Mako.
Mako's can make it happen, right?
Mako can make it happen.
And I think what's neat about Mako is, as you mentioned, it's 2 modes essentially of action, but it also comes with something very special and very unique, and that's the protective formulation technology.
Well, what that's doing is helping It gives you a little bit extra to help get the maximum benefit of the 2 AIs within the plant, getting on the plant, spreading on the plant, doing everything.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's just that differentiator gives a little extra boost with those 2 modes of action. That makes up Mako. And Mako, let's be honest, it's priced pretty darn fair for what you're getting.
It's a good ROI.
Yeah, definitely a good return on your investment as a grower. And, you mentioned earlier, when you mix it with the nutritional, take advantage of some of these passes, boy, you've got yourself a pretty good, I guess, security blanket for raising soybeans.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Other options for growers out there, there's a wide range of fungicides.
There's a lot.
I think, isn't the key, though, to just really sit down with your Helena representative to say, hey, what works really best in my field, my farm, and on my acre?
That is correct, because we could just go sell Mako on every single acre.
Right.
Be great. But if you want to take care of the customer's problem, talk to them and discuss what is your real disease, what is your major focus, and you have to pivot. And then if they want to go a different route, you still need a fungicide, need a nutritional in there. You still need a adjuvant. The days of just putting the fungicide out by itself and hoping for the best are not a good thing to do.
Now, that's something that often gets looked, and we talk about it here on the FieldLink podcast a lot. But boy, those adjuvants, that's the secret sauce for making really most products go from good to great.
Correct. And the one thing I do have, I got to mention this because I've seen this with multiple fungicides, and I have not seen it with Mako, but I've seen with fungicides that I've never worried about causing very cosmetic phyto, but it is across the board, and it's the thing that we think is happening. We're getting such good growing conditions, rapid growth. You got very tender leaves that have not had the waxy cuticle thicken.
Yeah.
And so you basically got a tender thing and you hit it with anything, and I'm talking anything, you get a little flash. And at first there's a lot of concern, but more and more of our reps were talking about it. Is growing fast, is cosmetic, because we're mainly an indeterminate bean crop.
Okay.
It will continue to grow out of it. And just, you still got to protect the new tissue. The plant will respond by growing new tissue, which becomes another haven for another spore. So you want to always be ahead of the disease, protect it. If you get a little cosmetic burn or whatever, it will grow out of it. It's never been shown to reduce yield. Never.
And I think that's a really important point. We can do that. I call it the 55 scouting. Growers are driving down their highway 55 and they see it miles an hour and they see the flash in the first call. But really, you do need to stop and get out and look and analyze what's going on.
See what's going on.
Yeah. And that flash, as you point out, it can be cosmetic. It tells you that the product and everything's actually there and happening and making things different.
Yes.
Okay, let's pivot to the next crop here that we certainly want to highlight in the South, getting a lot of attention now because all of a sudden we've got a rice crop out there that's getting some attention across the globe.
Yeah, we didn't have one last year.
Yeah.
Rice is a crop that you can count on fungicides being sprayed year in and year out. Sheath blight is probably the main one we go after, but you got blast, you got smut, you got all kinds of collection of diseases that we tend to pay attention to. And we have Tycoon, which is a sister to Mako.
Okay. Slightly
different ratio of mode of action of the 2 AIs.
Okay.
But it will do a bang-up job for a multitude of diseases out there. And some rice crops, depending on where you are, they may do a 2-shot. So they may do a Tycoon and then come back with something else. Or if there's some oddball disease like they are now dealing with in South Louisiana, unfortunately, it is nothing been shown to kill it.
Okay.
We're trying to outgrow it
Outgrow it and kind of control it?
I'm trying to boost fertility so the plant's natural defenses can outrun it.
Okay.
But so far, that's pretty much only in South Louisiana. But in the biggest rice growing area, Arkansas, Tycoon will play a role. Avares 2XS will play a role. If somebody doesn't want the full broad spectrum that we can deliver with Tycoon, because it's the triazole in there to me is a little stronger than the triazole in Avares 2XS for those specific diseases in rice.
Okay.
So you can pivot, and like soybeans, there's a multitude of other choices.
Sure. There's a lot of things in the arsenal as it relates to fungicides. Certainly, we want to highlight some of the premium ones that we have here at the Helena Products Group. In this case, Tycoon being one for rice, and really for Mako for soybean growers in the South as well. Two really good options for them. Let's go back to rice though. One of the biggest differentiating factors with Tycoon is also the protective formulation technology.
Yes, it has the same thing, helping increase the spreading in the plant, taking into the plant the additives that we put in there, help make it better than put the same two AIs by itself, but just inerts.
Yep.
And one thing about rice that a lot of people that do grow rice, they think about this every day. Arrowweb blight is in soybeans. Mm-hmm. Same pathogen causes sheath blight. So a lot of times what they're doing in the rice field this year is not only to protect this crop right now, but to lower the inoculum that overwinters to impact the soybeans.
The following year.
Yeah, and then the soybean guys that are growing soybeans now, then going to have rice next year, they're really keying in on arrowweb blight so it doesn't become a sheath blight problem next year.
Okay, and I think that's a really good point. You know, you're not just protecting this year's crop, you're helping protect
reduce the
next
inoculum
year's.
that overwinters.
Yeah. It's all about management, isn't it, Michael?
Yes, it is.
Okay, great. And back to Tycoon, another product that's really, for what you get, very competitive.
Yes, and Tycoon's, I'm a little plug for the rest of the crops in the business unit. Tycoon is registered on a large number of crops.
Okay.
And Mako is limited to a couple crops.
Okay, awesome. Okay, well, definitely a great portfolio. And the neat thing about Tycoon, kind of like Mako, if you're making that trip, you've potentially got an opportunity to add some other products along with it.
You don't have an opportunity, you need to.
Perfect.
You're protecting the crop, but you need to feed it as well.
Yeah.
Take advantage of that trip.
Double down, right? You're already covering it with the trip. And the research has shown, Michael, I mean, it's a no-brainer for rice, correct? You've got to utilize a fungicide.
Yeah, if you don't, you will not like yourself. Yeah. Your banker will not like you.
Yeah. Financially, I think that's the key as we wrap this episode up. You know, it's all about return on investment, picking the right product, really utilizing it at the right time, and then leveraging the opportunity to add a nutritional. Maybe you need a shot of nitrogen. Let your Agri-Intelligence specialist help guide you in that area as well. There's a lot of tools in the toolbox here, and it's all about maximizing the return on investment. Dr. Michael Kenty, I want to thank you for joining us on this episode of Field.
Thank you, Bill.
And welcome back to FieldLink. And joining us from Nashville is Jody Lourens from the FieldLink Market Report. Jody, I hope you had a good 4th of July holiday.
Yeah, we did. It was really hot in Nashville, and the heat and humidity brought a bunch of rain. So I had enough time to do some stuff outside, and then during the rain, had an opportunity to take a nap or two. So just about a perfect low drama 4th of July for an old person.
Well, as America celebrated the 250th anniversary of our nation, certainly the weather was all over the board. We had a lot of heat, as you mentioned, a lot of storms. We had a 3 or 4 hour delay in D.C. for that big celebration. You know, the market reacted a little bit, didn't it, here in the last couple of days to some of those celebratory things as well as weather? Let's talk a little bit about that, Jody. Tell us a little bit about the markets, what's going on in the corn and soybean market today.
Well, since we put out the podcast a couple of weeks ago, the biggest piece of news was
that was on the radar was going to be the June stocks and acreage report, which was released last Tuesday. And the price action from late May up until the report was really, really bearish, one of the worst Junes that we'd seen in a long time. And what a lot of people were really more worried about than a big bullish surprise was that the USDA was going to find a bunch of extra planted acres, despite the wet spring and despite the high fertilizer cost. And fortunately, they did not. The ranges were right in line with what we kind of came out with, just a little over 95 million acres of corn, a little over 85 million acres of beans. And that really just highlights that right at about 180 million acres is the cap of what the U.S., unless it's a really great price and margin year, can plant or wants to plant.
Right.
And with that, the markets breathed a really big sigh of relief, because probably a lot of people still have some scars from it. But the 2025 report had significantly more corn acres than expected, and corn fell really hard. And I think there definitely was some worry about something like that. But with those numbers, we bounced from then. And with the holiday weekend, no trade on Friday, basically everything closed Thursday at the normal time at 1:20 Central Time. There was a trade meeting going on that kind of had snuck up under the radar between China and the U.S., and neither side had spoken much about it, and the oddity that President Trump didn't even tout it. But then late Thursday, Friday morning, I guess, it came out that they had a very substantial meeting, and a couple of the key sticking points, the U.S. dropping the 10% fentanyl tariff of what China does sell us for the drug manufacturers, and then China dropping the 10% import tariff on U.S. corn, beans, and wheat. All of the sudden, we were able to process that news over the weekend. And you look at what happened. We're recording this on Monday the 6th. You had corn up 15 to 17 today. You had beans up 45 to 50, and wheat up 14 to 16. And really, you got three bullish pieces of news. First of all, the U.S. weather, and whenever we're in early July, you got to talk about what the pollination forecast looks, since probably about 5-10% of corn is already in pollination. It is bringing some heat back, like we saw in late June, that may creep over back into Illinois across the Mississippi River, some of that 90s and potentially low 100s for kind of mid-month and later. And that China's bullish news, because that certainly could open the door for them to follow through on all of the things in May from the May trade deal, 25 million metric tons of beans, and then potentially 8 to 10 million metric more tons of corn. You add that in with the lack of a shock from the USDA, and you really end up with a much different attitude than we had a week ago, because the U.S. crop is good but not great. We're not where we were last year. And when you look at world weather issues on top of some concern in the U.S., Europe is still in the middle of a terrible drought, and their crops are just baking. So India also has an issue that their monsoon came in very disappointing for June, when they count on that moisture to get the crops planted and off to a good start. So if you have two major net exporters turning into net importers this year, it really changes how the whole world balance sheet and where those bushels are distributed around the world. All bullish news today.
Yeah, definitely. Very interesting. The weather certainly does drive a lot of narrative, not just locally, but globally. And we're certainly experiencing a lot of our heat here throughout the United States. But boy, Jody, as you pointed out, globally, that impact is certainly impacting the commodity markets.
Yeah, and I read something today, and I saw it in a couple different pieces of research, so it's got some credibility. The U.S. is on, or the world is on track, despite South America's record crops and everybody else, somewhere between 400 to 500 million bushels less of corn and wheat combined, which really puts you at a position that, and they're dropping estimates by the day. Some people think it could be as high as 2 billion bushels, but you really went from, gosh, if we have another big crop year in the United States alone, we'll be adding to world supply. And right now it looks like we're going to be taking off a fairly substantial amount, which is why you see everybody standing up and paying attention today.
Wow. Hey, okay, Jody, let's circle back to that Chinese trade meeting. Boy, that did, as you mentioned in your opening, it slid under the radar for a lot of folks. Okay, what kind of, what do you think's driving those meetings?
I think if push came to shove, the answer about everything that happens in Washington is about the midterm elections.
Okay.
And I think that, Trump administration, they have to have the middle America, the rural vote that got the House and the Senate and the presidency in the last cycle. And to do that, you have to start with a healthier on-farm income, because that bleeds to all of the rural areas. And that certainly is part of it. I think that they finally got tired of China dragging their feet and decided to make some concessions in this. And I think Trump is really trying to tie everything up. You look at Iran, you look at $68 crude, you look at gas prices dropping so sharply at the pump that they are really trying to tie up whatever loose ends can help them keep the House in the November elections.
Well, and prior to this meeting, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but China was kind of on target with a lot of their commitments that they'd made to us several months ago. Is that pretty accurate?
From the beginning of the year, they had still not really moved towards anything from the new, what they said was an agreed upon trade deal at the May meetings. And really, because for China, and what we have to start seeing for this to have any validity, is that we have to see China buying roughly 30 to 35 million bushels of beans every week till the end of the year. Okay. And then you start throwing on the extra things, and the fact that U.S. bean prices had fallen so far that we were, for a while before last week's report, a good bit cheaper with a better quality bushel than anybody than Brazil did. So I think, there are a lot of reasons here, and China, I think, needs it because they see some economic expansion, some very slow economic expansion happen. But just, I think the fentanyl thing, once they got over that hurdle, they'll gladly, they make far more money on the fentanyl, selling fentanyl to the United States, than the bushels that they buy from us, that total. So you have to start weighing all of this and kind of get into the cross currents in the tall weeds on a lot of things.
And I think it's important for listeners to know the fentanyl we're talking about here is for medical purposes, not the illegal stuff, right, Jody?
Right. Yeah. This is not coming over in a tunnel across any of the borders, the southern borders. This is medical, for painkillers and for other things that fentanyl is used in. So, this is a completely legitimate transaction.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, Jody, cotton. Let's talk to me a little bit about cotton. We've seen kind of an uptick there.
It bounced today along with the trade news in hopes that China will return as a buyer of U.S. cotton, and they can begin to work some things out. Cotton, peaked out in the mid 80s, almost pushing to 90 when crude oil was at 100. And that's when the demand for natural fibers was really at its highest because all of the polyesters made from crude oil or oil-based products, and those prices shot up significantly. So that's when we got the $87, $88 cotton.
Sure.
And once crude fell, you don't think about cotton in that capacity like you think of bean oil or ethanol or biodiesel, something like that. But it certainly played into it. And the U.S. crop's in good shape, not great shape. The Hurricane Prediction Center for the United States has a below average year of landfall for hurricanes. So that protects, in the minds of a lot of people, you can take out some weather premium out of the Southeast cotton market. So several different things, but you did creep back up today. And I think that probably 78 to 81, we might be in this range for a while unless China just comes in and says, oh yeah, and we agreed as part of the trade deal to buy how many ever bales of cotton. Then that could be an exciting piece.
Well, Jody, with these markets turning uptick like this, it's time for growers to really think about maximizing yield. What are some strategies that you think growers really, from a marketing standpoint, need to be thinking about for their corn, soybeans, and cotton over the next?
Well, we talked about one of the strategies 2 weeks ago was that I was buying and recommending buying some call options as a protection if we had all of it unfold the way that we have. They call them courage calls in hopes that the market rallies, so that when you get rallies like this, if corn goes another 10 or 15 higher, you will have the ability to sell it knowing that you still have upside potential even for sold bushels. So I think you really have to begin to reset the whole market and see actual sales and a consistent pace of sales to China. But I can very easily see a retest of $5 December corn, a run at the November bean highs of 12.16. Both of those were made in early May. And just simply from a demand standpoint. And then if this hot, dry weather stays in there, comes into the U.S. and creeps back across into the Eastern Corn Belt in Illinois, things could become very interesting from now until, harvest begins. And to do that, you just have to be paying attention, have your sales orders in with your buyers, know where all your break-evens are and what you're doing, because we know how quickly these markets can move. And for everybody that was undersold on the first rally and then had just that gut-wrenching feeling during May and June when prices were falling so sharply, pay attention to that lesson that sales do need to be made when we get these rallies, because we never know which outside factor could come in and chop a leg out of it.
Yeah, definitely a lot of good opportunity ahead of us here in the short term. As growers, are right in the middle of the season, now's the time to start maximizing yields because you got those bushels. Boy, pretty good spot to be in right now. Jody, I want to thank you for joining us here on this episode of FieldLink.
Thank you, Bill.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of FieldLink. Be sure to join us at the Farm Progress Show on September 1st through the 3rd as we bring the Innovation Mobile Learning Center to Boone, Iowa. We'll highlight in-field product demonstrations, the latest in innovative products from the Helena Products Group, along with Agri-Intelligence and Seed Insight. Make plans to join us at the Farm Progress Agronomy Zone because innovation never stops.